Terrific. Well, welcome everyone who is joining us today. I'm Ginger Ostro, Executive Director of the Board of Higher Education. And I would we're going to start with some quick introductions of the folks that will be presenting today. So let me turn it over to my colleague, Brian Durham over at the Community College Board.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Brian Durham. I'm the Executive Director of the Community College Board. I'm glad to be here, and I'll turn it over to Jennifer Foster.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer Foster. I've lost my voice, so I won't be speaking much today, and I'll turn it over to Janine Miner.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Janine Miner, Chief of Staff at IBHE.
Great, thank you very much. So we're all going to be pitching in here to help poor Jennifer out, who is not going to be presenting, but really deserves a lot of credit along with Janine for getting us to this place and the work that we're going to talk about today. So I'm just going to say a quick hello so that we can dive in, a quick hello and welcome to let you know how excited we are to be at this place of having released the equity plan framework. As everyone knows, this is an important part of the higher ed strategic plan, which is called A Thriving Illinois. In fact, it's the second goal of A Thriving Illinois. And we did not rehearse this, so I'm not sure if I'm talking about this slide or if it's supposed to go to Janine, but I will keep talking until somebody signals that I should stop. So the equity plan work is part of A Thriving Illinois, and everyone knows that when we talk about A Thriving Illinois, I always start with this slide because we really want to emphasize how much higher ed is essential to ensuring that the state thrives, and that means economically, and we want equitable prosperity, and you can see that in the definition. And so everything we talk about is around educational equity, and Illinois' economic growth is being intertwined. And the equity plans are just a really core part of the work that we all together will do to make sure that we are closing equity gaps and so that individuals, families, and communities across the state can thrive. Can we go to the next slide, please? So sort of covered this 3 goals in A Thriving Illinois. First, to close equity gaps for students who've been left behind. Secondly, focusing on financial futures, both making sure higher education is affordable, but that we're providing resources to institutions to have stable ability to plan and invest in supporting students. And finally, economic growth and higher education's role in innovation and making sure we have the talent we need to grow the economy. So those are the 3 broad goals. And as I mentioned, if we go to the next slide, actually, let me turn this over to Brian to talk a little bit about the Community College Board's specific goals. But as everyone knows, we did the Higher Ed Strategic Plan in collaboration along with ISAC. And so this is all very much aligned and reinforcing. Brian?
Yeah, I think you covered it well there, Ginger. I mean, it is ultimately the Community College Board and the Board of Higher Ed and ISAC all worked closely along with all the stakeholders in the system to develop A Thriving Illinois. The Community College Board also operates under, and as you can see, are very connected to the same goals that you see that Ginger laid out. But at the core of those is closing equity gaps. And so the discussion we're going to have today fits in just right into ultimately that strategic plan and the goals of the Community College Board, all of which are so integrated. And so we look forward to providing an overview and giving you an opportunity to answer questions. And I think it's important to emphasize that while we are going to just kind of walk through the plan and some logistics and those sorts of things, we do want to hear from you. There's a lot of people on the webinar. So we would ask that you put your questions in the Q&A or the chat, and we will answer what we can, and what we cannot, we will take down and make sure we incorporate into FAQs and are able to follow up with you. So from there, I think I will be able to turn it over now to Janine, who's going to start us off, and then we'll get into some more specifics after Janine's presentation here.
Thank you, Brian. And so as Ginger stated, that This is the equity plans as part of our strategic plan, equity strategy number 2. And A Thriving Illinois called on institutions to develop and implement equity plans and practices to close gaps. Then this was subsequently included in statute. These plans will outline specific steps to close equity gaps, including learning renewal strategies, reviewing and revising existing policies and practices, implement practices of interrogating disaggregated data at multiple levels to understand points of intervention and whether solutions are actually working, as well as predictive analytics. An equity impact analysis, which is going to provide a structured approach to ensuring decisions are made after analysis of impact on underserved groups, campus climate survey with actions based on findings, and professional development designed to achieve equity. Next slide. So in part of statute was that we were going to, in establishing these equity plans, is that we were working with ICCB in collaboration with them and putting together an advisory committee that will help us to come up with recommendations on what should be included in the equity plans. And I'm not going to read all of this to you, but I'm sorry. You could go back one more, Jennifer. I won't read all of this to you, but just to point out a few things. Like I said, we were in collaboration with ICCB. We're going to be reporting it's an annual assessment that we have to report. So when you guys give us these equity plans back in May, we're going to have to assess them. And then we have to report back out to the governor and the General Assembly annually after we assess these reports. I'll just give you a few more seconds to look at the different bullet points. Okay, Jennifer, next slide. So again, we established an advisory committee that composed of 20 individuals from all sectors of higher ed, and it was co-convened by ICCB. So the charge of this advisory committee was to make sure that they listened to different components that could be included in an equity plan, and then came up with recommendations for this framework that we're going to be going with you later on in this presentation. And you can see a full list of our equity plan advisory committee members by going to IBHE's website. And we have our work underway where it shows the full list of the equity plan advisory committee members. Next slide. So this is the data that was part of the strategic plan and that we looked at for understanding the gaps in higher ed. So from looking at disparities in post-secondary attainment, we know that individuals who hold post-secondary credentials have higher earnings, greater social mobility, and improved health and other positive life incomes. Yet even as more jobs require education past high school, we are far from our goal that 60% of adults will have a post-secondary degree or credential by the year of 2025, especially when we look at the data through an equity lens. So the first map on your left ranged from 21% at Brown County to the top to 58% in DuPage County. And then if we cut that geography another way, we have comparisons for adults in rural compared to non-rural communities. We see that rural adults are less likely to have a bachelor's degree, but more likely to have an associate's degree or some college than adults from non-rural areas. We also see that more rural adults have a high school diploma, GED, or less education than non-rural adults. Jennifer, next slide. Thank you. And can you press it a couple times so the circles can come up? We also looked at disparities in attainment outcomes and disaggregated it by race and ethnicity. And while 48% of white adults have a degree, only 31% of African American and 22% of Latinos have a degree. This is equally significant are the percent of adults who started college but never received a degree. That's 21% of our white population, 28% for African Americans, and 17% for our Latino adults. That represents 323,389 African Americans, 682 Latinos, and 1 million plus white adults. This shows us tremendous opportunity we have by better serving adults in our higher ed system by closing these historical gaps. And we can take a closer look at more equity gaps. Next screen, facing African American students. So between 2013 and 2019, enrollment dropped 34% for African Americans at the same time that enrollment for white undergraduates dropped by 26%. And this is even before the desperate impact of COVID. Now we have the impact of COVID and enrollment dropped even more. There are now 40,000 fewer African American students enrolled than there was in 2013. That is a 37% drop in African American undergraduate students compared to 34% decline in white students. And we know from other IBHE analysis that African American students have less access to early college experiences and are more likely placed in developmental education and less likely to be retained in advanced class status. All this leads to dramatic and persistent gaps in the rates institutions graduate students, which you can see on the charts to the right. Jennifer, thank you. Next, as we look at the experience of Latinx students, we see that enrollment has increased by 3% since 2013, with just over 122,000 students enrolled. But you can see that the pandemic also had an impact here in 2019. Just over 128,000 Latinx students were enrolled. However, our analysis shows that gaps exist in the rates institutions retain in advanced Latinx students compared to white students, which means that we see that institutional gaps in completion rates exist and persist over time. The good news is that the completion rates at public universities increased from 52.3% in 2019 to 53.1% in 2021. Okay, Jennifer. And then we also see these same patterns of inequity that exist for low-income students. Between 2013 and 2021, Illinois enrolled over 100,000 fewer low-income undergraduate students, a 36% decrease compared to 22% decrease for non-low-income students. We are really seeing that the pandemic impact here. For comparison, between 2013 and 2019, we saw a drop of 85,000 low-income students. Our data analysis shows gaps in access to early college, retention, and advancement for low-income students compared to non-low-income students. And again, we see institution completion rate gaps. So, as we're looking at all of this data, and we're looking at our framework for the equity plans, we're going to be using this data to inform what our equity plans are going to, what we're going to report in our equity plans. So I'm going to pass this over to I'm sorry, I forgot Jennifer cannot speak. So Brian, are you going to walk us through the framework? Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So before I do though, there's two data questions in the chat. And so I don't know, Ginger, if you want to look at those and see if we can answer them.
The second question for sure, I know we can disaggregate the data and we do have it for sure by, well, obviously we presented it by race and I believe we can do it. We definitely have gender by race and gender, and I'm pretty sure we can do race and age groups as well. We do have race and gender already done in some different presentations that we didn't share today. So we'll just take notes on all of this and make sure that we can make this data available. And yes, all of the data questions that you guys are asking, obviously a core of this is data. So rather than trying to answer them on the fly, I think it'll be better for us just to take them down and make sure we're getting you all of this information. And I want to acknowledge the question on some college, no degree, and find out about the certificates as well. So yeah, so I think easier just to collect all these and then get the data. And
yeah.
yes.
Yeah, I agree. I think to some college, no degree, I'm going to say we want to check with our data folks, but I'm expecting that it does not include. If they have a certificate, they're considered a graduate. But we'll check and clarify all these in FAQs. Yes, you will be able to access a copy of the presentation. But before we dive much deeper into additional questions, let me push us forward here a little bit. So generally speaking, this is the framework for the equity plans. Each institution is going to adopt this outline and incorporate the information that's laid out below. I'm not going to read all those to you. You have the plans, you will see this, but you'll see that there's things like what statements have been adopted, mission statement, other statements that support DEI, and an institutional vision for equity. And remember that this is an equity plan, so it is. All these things are important, but it's also about what are you institutions going to be doing? What do they have in place? And what are they going to do? So let's move ahead. One more slide. Okay. So what, as Ginger alluded to, ICCB and IBHE are going to provide some data to institutions. We are still sorting through what that's going to what that will look like and how it will be transmitted. But we do have much of this data. However, I do want to emphasize the importance that institutions need to be looking at their own data as well, and particularly because your data is going to be more actionable and it's not going to suffer the same lags that we will have at the state level. But you can see a variety of pieces here, additional relevant institutional data, utilize our data to fill gaps. So really your institution data is really the more important linchpin here with our data fulfilling that, identifying major barriers in policy and practices after you've identified the gaps, and then assess your efforts to meet those challenges or meet those equity gaps. Ginger, anything you want to add to that?
I think just conceptually here, the idea is how are we doing doing an assessment of where we are? So it is looking, as Brian said, at data, but it's also using that data to flag areas where you might be able to then unpack a practice that is creating a barrier for students or a policy that's in place. So all of this is really meant to give you guidance on how to assess the situation on your campus, because these are individualized, and the gaps that you're seeing among your different students and what those barriers may be. So it is about taking that step back and identifying where you need to look, because we can't tell you on your campus what may be creating challenges, and that's the goal here. And then the last part, really looking at what have you tried and what have you learned from that, and again, how does that inform this assessment of what you're going to put forward going as part of the plan, which is a little bit later. So I just want to stay focused on really what this is, each section is trying to accomplish, in addition to kind of the literal steps that are outlined.
Yeah. Okay. So we also want to assess campus climate and look at the climate and culture. I think many institutions already do this or do some version of this. I mean, certainly we want to hit all the populations that we can, underrepresented, low-income, rural, individuals with disabilities, et cetera. And ultimately, I think the one thing that I want to emphasize here is that this, and we'll say it later, but this is a baseline survey. And so you may have just done one of these that you will be able to utilize, or it may be in progress. I mean, I do want to let folks know that I don't think there's an expectation that institutions hurry up and deliver one of these by May 31st if it's not already in the works. It's just where are you and how do you get that implemented? And I think that's really important. And Ginger, if you want to mention kind of what the overall focus is here as you did on the last one.
Yeah, I think it's just, everyone understands the power of the information you can get from a campus climate survey. And we think it's really important as we're assessing equity to really understand the experience of students, faculty, staff that they have on each campus. And so that's why gathering this information through a campus climate survey, and we know many of you already do this, I think is another of those foundational pieces. Like it's a type of data, obviously, but it's not the quantitative data that we're giving you, but this is that specific information on your campus. What are people telling you they're experiencing? And that's something that you will obviously want to reflect on and address as appropriate. And that's what we want to hear from you here is, what did you learn by doing the campus climate survey, and then ultimately how that informs the steps you're going to take as part of the plan.
Perfect. Thank you. Next slide. A lot of words here. I'm going to read all of these to you. No, not really. But you will get this. This is also in the plan. I think it's important to emphasize a couple of concepts here. One is that we're looking really for a holistic plan. I mean, this is not, meshing together three plans that you have across different places. This is ultimately, we're looking for an institutional level, institution-wide plan. We are going to need to see a timeline and recognize that these are sometimes intractable challenges. So we're looking for both short-term and long-term outcomes of the work that you're going to do. And this will be something that we continue to do and learn from and build upon over the years. So ultimately, we're gonna be taking on these longer term challenges, but we want to be thinking in terms of outcomes in both the short and long term. And finally, and I think I mentioned that, tying into the broader planning process, how the equity plan ties in. So Ginger, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is really those words at the top, an integrated, holistic plan. Like, how are you bringing all of this together? What you know from your data, what you know from your policy barriers, from the practice barriers, from what you learn on the climate survey, from other assessments that you might have done, your lessons learned from things you've changed. What does that tell you about what you need to do in a cohesive, integrated way to close equity gaps? What this is not is a list of programs or a list of affinity centers or things like that you have on your campus. Those things are important components of a plan, but we'd like to see how you're seeing them interrelate, work together, provide a holistic set of strategies that will close equity gaps. So again, what's underlying this is something that's going to work for you and work for your campus based on your assessment of what the challenges are. And again, to just emphasize what Brian said, it's not we're going to solve this in 12 months, but what are the steps we're going to take in the near term, and how does that align with what you see needing to change over the longer term? So for me, integrated, holistic plan is really the key here, because we really want your best thinking and how we're going to address these challenges as we go forward.
Next slide. So, so we get to the fun part here. Once I go through a couple of just what I will call logistical pieces. Again, reminder, and I think every time we talk about this for this year, this is a baseline plan. We ultimately we've spent a lot of time on it. We've worked at the advisory committee. We've discussed this with the entire higher ed system. And ultimately, we needed to put this out and let institutions work with it from wherever you are. We recognize that there are many institutions that have participated in ALEA, for example, with the Partnership for College Completion. We recognize that there are many institutions that have done this work already. We also know that there are others that are really just starting or thinking about it. So it's a baseline plan, and we're gonna learn from it as much as you're gonna learn from it in this first year. We do need you to identify your equity plan contacts and submit those to IBHE and ICCB, and for the public universities and private institutions that may be engaged in this, that IBHE email. For the community colleges, you're going to submit that to ICCB. We do want you to think about and identify your internal planning team, and think about and identify and start with your organization's vision for equity, including if you have a new strategic plan, you're going to work with that. If you have those institutional documents, et cetera. Our plan is to hold some periodic, what we'll call drop-in or office hour type conversations, where Janine and Jennifer, when her voice is back, will be available as resources, and others as we go along. You know, there's going to be a lot of data questions, for example. And so we know that our institutional researchers at the state level are going to be very engaged, in the conversation. We're also going to be putting together listserv and sharing information. And from today, I can see half a dozen questions right now that we probably can't answer. So we're going to be working on an FAQ to address those questions, and ultimately encourage you to submit questions to us via email as they come up. And we will continuously be updating that information as we go along. Ginger, anything you want to add to those comments before we kind of try to tackle some of the questions that have come across? Okay. So I'm going to scroll us up a little bit and look at the questions where we are. The easiest question I've seen: will we get a copy of the presentation? You will get a copy of the presentation. It'll be posted on our websites, and certainly I'm sure we can share this out. Terrence Bond asked, how does institutional vision for DEIA differ from institutional vision for equity? You know, Terrence, I'm going to say that that's an institutional conversation right there. I think ultimately that is something that your institution will have to talk about. Ginger, you were about to say something.
I was just going to suggest we take down the slides if we're going to the Q&A. It just might be easier for folks to be able to see.
Okay, there you go. You can see us. So Jeff had a resource. Please share that with us. Do you see Sean Lamar Hudson's question? For colleges and universities are part of a system, is the expectation that each institution in the system has its own vision, or can we use a system-wide vision? Anybody want to tackle that one?
I think if you have your own vision, you would use that. If what you're working from is the system-wide one, then use that. I think the answer is both and, because I think I'm aware of institutions that are part of systems that have their own and have a system one. So Jennifer's nodding, so I'm assuming she agrees with that. We won't make her say that.
I agree with that. I think it's an institutional decision, as much like what you said for Terrence as well. So
it's certainly a part of the conversation, right? As part of that institutional conversation. Will there be a standard climate survey?
So I think this is a really interesting question, and there's a lot of dialogue in the chat about this with some resources that people have shared. We were asked that literally this question: should there be a standard climate survey? And I think we did not want to assert that, but we wanted to do some research and see if there is one that makes sense. For now, from my perspective, and we didn't really discuss this. I think if folks have, like the resources that are here, some people may have already done a climate survey. Some people may want to use something that's recommended. Maybe we could put together some recommendations for now. But I don't think we're ready to move and say everyone in the state needs to use this standard climate survey. Though there's a lot of reasons why having something standard in an out year would make sense. But because we know people have some that are already done or recently done, we don't want to make folks redo it. But I think it's great that everyone was weighing back and forth on pros and cons. So when we get those contact people of who are going to be working on the plans, we'll probably come back to you after we do a little bit more research on this, on what a standard one might look like, with some of the prepackaged ones.
This year is a baseline year. We want to collect what everyone is doing, and then we can make some decisions as we go forward.
Yeah. So an ongoing conversation, I think, is the state level conversation there. When will the final data be provided? Sometime late winter, I think we were talking about, right?
Late winter, early spring is what we were talking about.
So I think some of the data might be available sooner, and I think we'd like to get you that as soon as we have data. And then some of the other things like that were earlier in the chat, that where we may not have disaggregated by race and age and gender, all of those factors, if it's possible to do that, those might take a little bit longer. But our goal, I think, is to get you data as soon as possible so that you can be working on the plans data informed.
Yeah, but I will remind you that institutional data is really the key, and the state level data is to help fill in those gaps. And so don't wait around just for the state level data. I mean, the state level data, we'll get it to you as soon as we can. Amanda asked what funding might be available. Well,
is that for climate survey or for doing the work overall? But the answer is probably the same, but I'm just curious if there was,
so Amanda, there's currently no funding for doing this. Institutions are going to be taking this on themselves. That does not preclude pursuing funding at a later point, but as of today, there is not any additional set aside for funding for this. Okay, so.
I think the question on when do we need to submit the information, I think that question popped up when you were talking about identifying the contact person to send it into.
The deadline for submission is
the deadline for the identifying the contact people to the IBHE and ICCP website. I think that's when that question popped up, but you can clarify it.
We want that as soon as possible, certainly. I don't know that we had a specific deadline in mind.
Just as soon as possible.
As soon as possible, and certainly we'll be following up if we don't see those contacts submitted in an expeditious manner. Let's see.
Defining rural and adult students. I think that goes back.
Where was that?
It's right after what funding might be available. I'm interested in how you define rural and adult students. I think what I would suggest here is we do have some definitions that we're using in the data that we're going to provide to you. So let us get you that, because I think part of the challenge in assessing these is if everybody's using different data, it's going to make it much harder to determine, and obviously determine if we're having an impact. So we will get you the underlying definitions that match what we showed you in the earlier slides.
Yeah, and we certainly have some standard definitions for those things at the state level, so can share those. So will the video be shared? We can share the video along with sharing the slides. Yes. The ongoing process moving forward, should we expect to annually submit, but have a longer term vision? So Ginger, I see you nodding. You want to tackle that?
Yeah,
one?
I think this is exactly right. The long-term vision is we do those charts that Janine went through at the beginning, and we don't have any gaps. We'd love to not see enrollment declining either, but that we're not seeing gaps. And obviously there's the enrollment, persistence, and completion and student loan repayment rate. So our goal is to not see any gaps. Obviously, that's not a one-year plan, and a series of one-year plans isn't going to get us there. So that's why in the timeline we said, what do you think longer term, and then what are you biting off in the first year? And then we'll be working to review that, assess that with you, and then bigger picture, watching the statewide data as well as individual institutional data to see if those gaps are closing. So I think this is exactly the right way to think about it. What does it look like over time? And then what are we doing in each year?
Are equity plans exclusively focused on students pursuing post-secondary credential, or should we also focus on adult ed programs? These are institutional equity plans. So if you serve adult ed students at your institution, then I think you should consider adult ed students in your equity planning. And that does make me think that though we are answering verbally some of these questions, we'll incorporate all this into FAQ as well, folks. Terrence, primary contact or team for the equity plans. I think we want a submission of a contact. That doesn't mean at some point we may want to know what your total team looks like, but certainly we want to focus on getting that specific contact from your institution at first.
And we did say contact or contacts. So
yeah, can be more than one. There are a couple of emails, April, that you can submit to. I don't, Jen, do you mind posting those in the chat so she can have those? Timeline for IBHE, ICCB provide feedback, turnaround time for making any updates if needed. I think that is a question that we're going to have to circle back to you on. We haven't finalized all that yet, but certainly we're going to be providing some feedback, and there will be, I mean, ultimately we've got to see what we get in and have some logistical conversations ourselves before we can give you that answer. Should the equity plans cover a specific number of years? So what are we thinking on that? Ginger, Janine?
it comes after the analysis this summer of all the plans, and then we can make that determination.
Well, I think they're asking oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. So that kind of gets back to Ginger's earlier statement about the 1 year, 3 year, 5 year vision. I mean, there's multiple kind of elements to it. I think you want to focus on the particulars of what the plan is talking about, thinking about short-term, long-term outcomes. But there are, we want to see progress. Ultimately, when we get plans, we're going to look for progress. But certainly these are not generally problems we're going to solve in 1 year. And Kimberly, absolutely, we can keep our eye open for that. And actually, once we get a listserv built, we can have that set up in such a way that it's for information sharing, not just one-way information sharing. And in doing so, that as others see opportunities or tools or what have you, the group can share amongst themselves as well. And Anthony, that's great. The Community College Diversity Commission is going to do some regional meetups across the state about this. That's fantastic. And I have one question in the Q&A. Let me just paste it over here. This is from Ruth Williams. Are the low-income students choosing to work since hourly rates and some salaries have gone up? Students may see the short-term benefits of this. Okay. I'm not sure, Ruth, that I totally understand your question. It was probably in the context of some of the earlier data. So if you want to restate that or clarify that for us. Do we have data on it? Well, so we'll try to come back to your question, Ruth. Let's see. Tamara, we are trying to get the data out as soon as possible. We're looking at late winter, but we're going to try to get it to you as quickly as we can. Mark, I would say if you serve dual credit students at your institution, dual credit students, because it's an institutional equity plan, should be included in the discussion of the equity plan. And Amy, you are expected to utilize institutional data and state level data and other data sources that you have available as you look to your plan. We have any other questions anybody wants to post in there, or if not, the panelists want to make any comments? Let's see. Yeah, I like your last answer there, Jen. We encourage you to submit your questions to us, and we'll take them down from here and also add them to an FAQ.
There's a question from Nick.
Yeah, I'm looking. Go ahead.
If each population in the legislation is required for each institution, I think if you do have those students and you have equity gaps, then you would need to address them, address how you're going to address the, sorry, I said that twice, the equity gaps, how you're going to close the equity gaps. If you don't serve that particular student population, then I think you note that in your plan, but the statute does specify the specific population groups to look at. And then Amanda, you have the other category is what? I'm not sure what that I'm sure came at a particular point in the conversation, and I think we may have missed the window there of what you were referring to. If you could just type that in.
As a part of the advisory committee, we had a whole laundry list of individuals and populations, and we just ask that you look at all of the populations that may experience an equity gap. We had a conversation about LGBTQ plus community. We had rural students. We had students with disabilities. So we would just say you utilize whatever you have internally in order to be able to close the equity gaps for that population.
And I think specifically, though, to add, the statute does also speak to students with disabilities. There were a couple of other, so there's both other statutory groups if you do serve those students, as well as any student groups that, as Jen said, you might identify it within your student body that weren't enumerated in the statute. Because I think it also says, or other underrepresented groups in the statute. So it's pretty broad.
You know, I do want to address kind of a little bit of a theme I'm hearing here, though, which is I hear a lot of compliance related questions, and there are certainly compliance pieces to this, but the entire exercise is not just about compliance. It is about the institutions engaging in thoughtful conversation and thinking about how they can close equity gaps. So if the question is, there are 5 categories. Do I need to report on 5 categories? If that's in the statute, the answer is yes. However, if you have additional populations or other ways to slice the data to think about equity gaps on your campus, we also encourage you to do that, because we want to utilize this process, and we want institutions to utilize this process to close equity gaps and to look at the data in whatever nuanced way they need to look at that data in order to help close those equity gaps. So don't feel constrained. I mean, we definitely have things we must address, but don't feel constrained in these equity conversations by the categories that are laid out. I think you can go beyond that. There are some state level statutory pieces that you have to consider as well, you know, so feel free and think about that. And I appreciate also Nathan providing a statement there in who's our, if you don't know, Nathan's our institutional researcher, and ultimately is the one who can answer a lot better than we can a lot of these data questions. So encourage you to reach out to Nathan separately as well. A couple of more questions popped up in the Q&A. Has consideration been given to students who identify as non-binary students? Does the state track these in groups? And I don't know, Nathan, do we track that information? But I would say, again, as you think about equity questions, you can go beyond what the state provides, and you can look to your own data and your own processes to think about the student populations that you think it's important to address. And we do track it, apparently, according to Nathan. So we have some data to share with you there. So, Ginger, I'll let you maybe close us out if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. And thanks everyone for your super thoughtful questions. I think for all of us, as you can tell, this is work we want to do together and to do collaboratively. As Brian mentioned, this is a conversation on campus. This is a conversation to have across institutions. It's a conversation to have statewide, what it's going to take to close equity gaps, and the work that you are embarked on already or will do as you work on these plans is really foundation to help us all move forward and address the needs of students. So thank you for all of this. We definitely want to get answers to your questions. I know there'll be lots of engagement around data as we all try to understand what we have, what we know, and then also for you on your campuses to really evaluate and understand those practices and barriers and where there's opportunities and things to change. So this is really a dynamic process. This isn't a compliance. That's the difference between, I think, what was the underrepresented groups report and what's the equity plan and practice. That's why we called it that. It's not just a plan, it's the change in practices that we're going to be looking at together. And so this is the beginning of a really important and helpful, or continuing an important and helpful conversation. So really appreciate all the questions in the chat and the ongoing conversations that we'll have as we work together to make Illinois the best in the country in serving our students. So I think with that, thank you to everyone. Thank you, Brian, Jennifer, Janine, for all your work and getting us to this point, and for all the work that's going to be done going forward. So appreciate this, everyone. And the question just on the recording being sent, I think we'll just post that on the website, I'm assuming. So we'll post it so folks who may not have been on will have access to it. So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.